You're not often going to get a sermon with a more easily memorable passage or text than this one, even though there's some close competition coming out over the next few weeks. In our church ESV Bibles, we've got 4 words. You shall not murder. You go to the older King James version of the Bible, it's also 4 words, but it's 1 letter shorter. Thou shalt not kill. Might want to think before we finish today if there's much difference between murder and kill. But if we go to the original Hebrew, it's even shorter. It's 2 words and just 6 letters. But look, don't worry, Hebrew cheats, they don't count back. Although it looks pretty simple, it's profound enough to spend more than just a couple of minutes here this morning looking at this single verse. That's what we're doing this morning. But before we just dive into this verse, can I just flag up where we are in the book of Exodus? This is such a familiar verse, and some of you might even know all those 10 commandments off by heart. This one about murder or killing is quite an emotive one. It's possible we just see it on screen and we plow into it and forget that it has a context. And I don't just mean that this is 1 word or 1 commandment out of a batch of 10. I mean that this is Exodus chapter 20, so that obviously there are 19 chapters leading up to this point in the book, and Exodus is a book of 40 chapters, so we are pretty much halfway through. We started going through this book a couple of years ago on Sunday evenings, going through those accounts of the earlier part of the life of Moses. We picked it up again more recently as God leads his people out of slavery in Egypt after that momentous showdown at the Red Sea. The sea that had, well, the water that had been a symbol of death earlier on in the book. Remember the fate that Pharaoh decreed for the Hebrew babies. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Well, that symbology has now been reversed. The Red Sea, different stretch of water, obviously, but instead this now becomes the symbol of death for the oppressors, but of liberation for the Hebrews. Celebrated in that triumphant Song of Moses, Exodus chapter 15, as it's usually called the Song of Moses, but actually, if we read it carefully, it shows that everybody joined in. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. And they're celebrating God as their protector. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him. And they're declaring to one another and anybody else who will listen down through the centuries, this is a God who will fight for his people. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Of course, he doesn't fight with the typical weapons. Think the cross, which looks like a defeat, but is actually the ultimate triumph. Conquering, as one of those hymns says, through sacrifice. But not conquering through sacrifice of his own people when the Hebrews are liberated. But this is not just a God who protects his people and fights for his people. He's not like the army being conscripted in to help in a time of crisis, like I suspect they probably were down at Carbis Bay in St Ives a fortnight ago, but who have now gone back to their homes again, which they take their infections with them. No, this is a God who has even bigger and more personal plans for his people, which is where the book is going to move on to. He doesn't just want to deliver and liberate his people, he wants to dwell and live with them. So Exodus 29:46, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God who brought them out of the land of Egypt. Notice now a purpose, a plan behind all of this, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. So that is the section of the book that we're going to be moving on to in coming months. So what's it going to look like if God dwells among his people? What if he is not just billeted here temporarily, but instead he becomes a permanent resident in our homes? These rules and these laws that we are now starting to encounter start to tell us about the new arrangements that will be implied by this. That's why chapter 20 starts with a reminder of the context. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And there's almost an implied, therefore, you shall. First of all, it's about honor for God himself. God alone, as it says in that verse, you shall have no other gods before me. Then when we come to number 5, there is honor commanded for parents, as we saw last time. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And perhaps we can group the remaining words as being about honoring our fellow human beings, honoring their lives, honoring their relationships, honoring their belongings, honoring their reputation. If we are going to honor God, what about human beings made in his image? It's exactly as Jesus said, quoting Moses, and a second commandment is like it, similar to, same theme, same flavor, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If we're going to honor God, how are we going to honor the people made in the image of God? Perhaps you could see this commandment that we're looking at today as the most obvious, the most basic of all. These are human beings made in the image of God. How could you most profoundly deface the image of God who created all things? You could destroy that image. You could wipe it out. You could trample it into the ground. Therefore, you shall not murder. But that's only the start of what this word has to say to us, I think. I've got 3 points, and those of you who might have looked at the notes on the screen, even printed some off. 3 basic points, and I think I might make them the same 3 points all the way through the rest of this series. But at least for today, I want to give you some headings for our thinking. You might see the headings again over those next few weeks, as I've said. First, what does this commandment not ban? Second, don't be limited by the literal here. And thirdly, flip it over. Let's start with this first one. What does not this command concerning murder not preclude? And this picks up the question I asked earlier. Is there a difference between kill and murder? I can't say I've done a thorough survey of the Old Testament on this point, but it looks to me as if the word that is used in this commandment is not the standard word for kill. There are several words that you could encounter if you could read it in Hebrew. There's a word that is used for killing animals by sacrifice. For example, out of many verses, here's one. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. Now, perhaps we could actually use the word slaughter there, because it's relating to animals. We have the word slaughterhouse, although nowadays it's typically replaced by the word abattoir, something French and sounding less gruesome and graphic. And there's also a word for what I suppose you might say is normally relating to humans, but not exclusively, just routine killing. In the King James Version, you probably see the word slay there. But here we got an example from earlier on in Exodus. God's giving Moses this command. This is what you're to say to Pharaoh. Let my son, that's the people of Israel, go so that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, I will kill your firstborn son. That was the, if you like, the threat, the warning that did eventually come to occur with the final plague and the death of not just Pharaoh's firstborn, but all the Egyptian firstborns. They were killed. But when you read the sixth commandment, it's a different word again, with perhaps a greater nuance of violence or malevolence, and perhaps as with the phrase, with malice aforethought. And it's specifically in the case of other human beings. You shall not murder. So my take on this is that this command doesn't preclude, for example, the killing of animals for food. That is killing, yes. I'm not saying that the manner in which animals are kept or slaughtered is irrelevant, but it's only killing and it's not murder in this sense of this commandment. Becoming a vegetarian is a legitimate choice of conscience, but it is not commanded by this word. Remember the impact of Jesus's words in Mark 7. He declared all foods clean, and that included meat. So that's one thing which I don't think is banned here, although people have appealed to this commandment for support for that point of view. They do so in good conscience, but I don't think they're reading the verse right. I can't say this verse precludes war either. There were times ahead as the people of Israel entered the promised land, the land that God has said, this will be yours, when they were told to kill other human beings. Now, I know that's highly contentious. I haven't got time to go into the ethics of that this morning. It certainly does trouble quite a lot of people. Ask me if you want it specifically addressed from the pulpit sometimes. I'm happy to do that. I just haven't got time to do it now. And I'm not saying that just any war for any purpose pursued by any means is automatically exempt from this commandment. It's another question in its own right. But we can't say that God is contradicting himself by this command concerning murder and then later commanding a war or even permitting military self-defense. So I don't think this commandment requires us to be pacifists either. Although, again, that is a legitimate point of view in which you may hold in good conscience, and many believers do. Finally, I don't think that you can use this verse to outlaw capital punishment either. I think it's very strange, actually, but the very argument you will sometimes hear to insist that it should be banned, picking up on the Bible, saying it cannot be right to take away the life of a human being made in the image of God by capital punishment. It is actually the argument of made in the image of God that is the reason given in Scripture why a murderer must be killed. Genesis 9. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Now, that isn't a popular thing to say nowadays, and I'm almost a bit nervous about this going on the website. But don't we have to be careful to base our thinking on what the Bible says and not what society says? People today claim to be so much more enlightened and humanitarian, but there are some absolutely massive blind spots in our current society and our modern thinking. We'll come on to them before too long. And follow them up this evening, most likely, as well. But bottom line, I don't think that this commandment, you shall not murder, requires us to be an abolitionist or a pacifist or a veggie, though you can be any or all three of those for other reasons, and that's fine. But one thing we certainly mustn't do with this commandment is to be limited by the literal. You see, in saying that this murder word is partway to what Shakespeare called murder most foul, there is an increasing danger that we can feel that we have kept this commandment. We can put a tick in the box and hold our head up high before God because, as one of the books I've been reading this week puts it, we are not murderers with a hyphen. The kind of thing that the rich young ruler, as we call him, came to Jesus boasting. As regard the commandments, well, he said, "Teacher, all these I have kept from my youth." Tick, 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 tick. Remember Jesus' take on that kind of attitude. Self-congratulatory approach to Pharisees. They might well have multiplied the number of rules to keep those Pharisees, but they minimized their individual force. And so, said Jesus, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, You will never enter the kingdom of heaven. What follows after that in the Sermon on the Mount is 6 worked examples showing the kind of thing he meant. And we had the first one of them just a few moments ago. It starts with a fairly unobjectionable summary of the law. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. That seems to me like a fairly reasonable summary. But Jesus does not accept this single point approach to the problem. It's not a single point. It's a whole axis of evil, from irritation and anger at one end, all the way up to murder at the other. See it go right back to its beginnings again, with the first human being born, showing the contamination of the "you shall surely die" running in his veins. That was Cain. Cain and his brother Abel bring offerings to God, Genesis 4. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry. That's where it starts. Anger, and his face fell. Read on a little while and we see the outcome, where that anger has led him to. When they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. But see what God had said to Cain as he was nursing that anger. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." If anger is a crouching lion ready to pounce, it has to be subdued and conquered now, or it will leap and metaphorically tear you apart. And the consequence will be that you would somewhat less metaphorically leap upon someone and tear them apart. So here's an interesting little quote from you from Jen Wilkins' useful little book that we might come back to again this evening. Jesus is teaching that if every person dealt with anger quickly and rightly, there will be no need for the 6th word at all. That's an interesting one, isn't it? If anger was nipped in the bud each time, we wouldn't get to murder. Folks, do you know what makes you angry? What presses your buttons, as we say? You know why. Have you considered what lies beneath your response? It can help, I think, if you realize why that particular situation gives rise to that kind of emotion within. So I don't think we always need necessarily to do an awful lot of profound self-analysis. Sometimes we could just take a more pragmatic, down-to-earth, practical approach, just realizing, admitting our pressure points and possibly confessing some of the things that we have done when we have not kept our cool. One kind of thing I've recently realized I have to get to work on is in a driving situation. It's a kind of queue, not this kind of logjam queue, but typically the kind of dual carriageway queue. The dual is going to come down to single file soon, single carriageway. And 2 lines of traffic are having to combine. And there's all these nice, polite people waiting in queue in the left-hand lane, and someone comes down the outside lane. You can see them in your wing mirror, and I see them in my wing mirror a long way back, and I can start to feel that. Why do they think their time is so much more important than everybody else's? They're going to go a mile down there and then push in and expect to be let in. And you can hear, there's something of, yeah, okay. I confess that really does press my buttons. It seems to me to anger me more than anything else on the road, and I really don't know why. You'll be glad to know that I've never really given into full-on road rage, but I have sounded my horn out of frustration and anger. No, it wouldn't give rise to actual murder. It's a situation that Jesus does make reference to. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, I could try and pick holes around this by saying, I'm not sure that that idiot in the outside lane is a fellow believer, so he's not my brother. But that's an evasion. It is worthy of the Pharisee inside that we probably all have some of. But Jesus' final sentence here, and although it's a bit obscure, "You fool." Well, if you've got a Bible with footnotes, you probably read it and said, this uses an old word, raka. Now, the nearest thing to that we have in modern days is, now don't worry, it's the kind of thing that should be decently bleeped out on TV, or would have been bleeped out 30 years ago. No, I haven't let rip with one of those words, but my thoughts have got too near them, or the level of anger that could start to generate them. I just need to change, or be changed, or else, says Jesus, I'm starting to move the slider along the axis of evil that has murder as its maximum volume end of the scale. No, I am not Mr. Ripper, the murderer. I am Master Ripper, the murderer's son, and starting to show something of that family heritage. And so I need Jesus Christ, not just to point out as teacher this fact. I need him as my savior from my sins. So folks, what really gets you going? Are we really still trying to just kid ourselves and justify ourselves? If we argue like a true Pharisee, we might be able to nearly convince ourselves that our anger is righteous. And maybe on rare occasion it is, but it is a rare occasion and it is just a moment, typically. Just like it can be fun for a moment to catch a tiger by the tail, but it is a perilous endeavor. And we simply need to listen to God's word. And that's why we started with this with the earlier reading. The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. It produces a whole load of self-righteousness in trying to justify ourselves. Finally, flip it over. Instead of being murderers, instead of being merchants of death, how can we be people of life instead? What will it look like in our lifestyles and attitudes? I mentioned earlier that my take on capital punishment, in principle at least, wouldn't be a popular, enlightened one nowadays. But there are plenty of far more pervasive assaults on life that are being presented to us as enlightened nowadays. They end far more lives than the electric chair or the hangman's noose will ever do. Folks, for all this world tries to sell itself as liberal and affirming, we live in a culture that embraces death very, very commonly. Even if you haven't read the notes in advance of this morning, you know where I'm going to go here, or you can guess at least. That most recent series of Call the Midwife, I thought, was a case in point, with all sorts of propaganda messages in there. The storylines in that series have moved on to the mid-1960s and the discussions that would lead to the 1967 Abortion Act. Now, I don't want to impugn the motives of David Steele, who I think, if I remember right, was the one who introduced that bill to Parliament. There were atrocities, backstreet abortions, that a civilized society needed to address. And you've got to honour that motivation. But the people warning where that eventual act would lead were right. I'm not always convinced with slippery slope arguments, but I think in this case it has been right. Since the passing of that act, there have been nearly 9.5 million abortions in England, Scotland, and Wales. Let's put that in context. That is approximately 1 every 3 minutes. The most dangerous place to be on these shores is not in a COVID ward or on the M6 at a rush hour, but in the womb. And to sustain this, we have to deliberately not think of the sheer horror of it. We have to change our terminology, for example. We say fetus now to make it sound more like a medical condition. We refuse to grant babies in the womb human status until our convenience has been served. Oh, it's not a good time for me right now. Folks, there is this current campaign, you know, some of you have signed up to it, to recognise the atrocities during the early 20th century in Armenia. Estimates are that between 0.6 and 1.5 million deaths occurred there during the period roughly spanned by the First World War. And yet babies are dying to abortion at a broadly similar rate over 50 years in this country. And the UK prides itself on being a humane society. How can we celebrate life against such a foul backdrop? We live in a country that has deliberately depleted itself of babies in the womb faster than the COVID-19 outbreak has been killing adults these last 15 months. But we've done that consistently over a period of half a century. Go to the other end of the human life cycle, and you'll see the same. Not so far down the slippery slope yet, but I think it will be a slippery slope. They call it euthanasia, which is just juggling with language once again. It's Greek for good death. The phrase they like to use, death with dignity. And it's well chosen to appeal because the dying process has plenty of indignities. But I would suggest we try to see through the spin to the basic word underneath, which is very literal, suicide. Literal because it's two Latin words stuck together, the sui from the Latin word for oneself, and then caedere, I think it is, the verb to kill. It is self-killing. And it is presented to us as so compassionate and wonderful. I'm not saying that I don't understand some of those arguments used about how awful it can be when the body starts to fail. I've seen some of that in my own family situation in the last year. I think we can read maybe a hint of it in Jesus's words to Peter. It might not be just about captivity, I've very often thought. John 21:18, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Now that's not nice, is it? But despite how it is being packaged in this country at this time, it looks to me as if in countries where euthanasia is being legalized, the culture of death is growing. And it won't be just people who are in dire pain and terminally ill, but those who feel that they are just old and becoming a burden or don't want to be. And maybe it's in a society where the fifth commandment is being forgotten. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. It won't be long until that starts to overlap into the sixth commandment as well. Older people will start to think it becomes their duty to die. And folks, let's roll that down into the younger age groups as well. Don't you think that it's so sad that we're told double-figure percentages are quoted about those who have contemplated suicide during these year and a bit of the coronavirus lockdowns? Have we really become so devoid of hope as a society? So quickly people will seriously contemplate death as an alternative. Folks, do we not have a duty to show people that this life is actually worth having and worth living? And actually more than that, that life beyond this world is available and so much more again worth having in Jesus Christ. We're told that bodily training is of some value, but godliness is of value in every way. But it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. Here's another longer second and final quote from Jen Wilkin here. Because we are accepted in the beloved, we will not be content to be simply not murderers, or not contemptuous, or not angry. We will not merely refrain from taking life, we will run toward giving it. Let us read in the 6th word's prohibition of murder, the exhortation to take every care to preserve life. Let us run to be life protectors, esteem givers, and peace makers. How can we flip over this command to not murder, most personally and most radically of all? I don't think it's just by becoming life protectors. I think it's by becoming life receivers. But there's not just literal suicide to guard against, but spiritual suicide. For physical suicide, you typically have to do something. For spiritual suicide, doing nothing is quite enough. Jesus said, I've come into the world as light so that whoever believes in me may not, see the word, remain in darkness. That's where we start. The darkness of sin, the greater darkness of its consequences. Those are our natural position, but we are called out of darkness into God's marvelous light. Turning from that darkness, coming into the light, will mean that once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you'd not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Folks, the most radical alternative to this world's culture of death is for you personally and individually to embrace the life of Jesus Christ. The offer is not just at the end of a sermon when we go on to communion and we've got those reminders of bread and wine, reminders that it was the murder of Jesus Christ that made this all possible. But no, folks, it is not just in that situation, it is now. The offer of life in Jesus Christ is the same as it has been written down through the centuries. It was Moses, the one who received those words from the finger of God that we've been looking at 3,000 years ago and more. Moses' nearly final words to the people of Israel are just as applicable today as we close with them. Heaven and earth to witness against you today that I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life. You and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, holding fast to him, for he is your life